Thank you for having me here. I would also like to say Daja Hao. This presentation is a modified presentation of my paper as I did it at MeTrans. So if you saw that presentation, there are some similarities. However, since I know that most of you don't know much about Sweden and the contexts that research is conducted in Sweden, I will provide you with a baseline, the most rudimentary knowledge about Sweden and how Sweden is maybe not relevant, but a little bit relevant to Americans. So, let's see here. Oh, Sweden. If you're an American, you might have heard about Swedish meatballs, for example, or the Swedish chef. But today there are other instances where we have Swedish connections. For example, H&M, Skype, which was acquired by Microsoft many years ago. It was a Swedish entrepreneur that founded it. We have Volvo, Spotify, and IKEA, for example. These are different brands that you encounter every day that are or have been Swedish. So what is Sweden then? Many people when they think about Sweden, they mix it up with Switzerland. And when you talk to researchers, they often think about Sweden as it was sometime during the 70s, like this welfare state that is close to socialism. And when you follow the debate in the US, there seems to be a very strong divide between people that paint Sweden as the utopia and those that paint this as basically a communist country that is one coup away from complete chaos. When you look into the research and when you look into like what international organizations say, you will find reports like this: Sweden's welfare state. Can the bumblebee keep flying? So the image is that Sweden has a very heavy state sector that is constricting the economy and causing a lot of issues in the market for different goods, for example. However, this report was produced in 2003. In 2015, it looked like this instead in many outlets. We had gone through the financial crisis. We had seen that the Scandinavian countries managed to pull through the financial crisis much, much better than most other European countries. And many researchers and also pundits were almost shocked by the fact that Sweden was doing so well. And it contradicts a lot of financial and economic theory on how you should read economies, etc. And lately, there has been another blow to this image of Sweden as a stale and controlled society, and that's the fact that Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, is the place in the world, second place beyond Silicon Valley, where they produce most billion-dollar startups. So there might be something that you need to look into if you have an idea of Sweden as being a socialist heaven. Here we see in the text, what do Silicon Valley and Stockholm have in common? Spawning billion-dollar tech companies. Sweden has also more entrepreneurs per capita than the US, and the entrepreneurial companies or the entrepreneurs have a more positive outlook on the future, and they also stay in business much longer than in the US. So turning your image of Sweden upside down a little bit, I would say. So where is Sweden? Oh, this is Sweden up here in Europe. And this is an image of that shows the gross domestic product per inhabitant in purchasing power. And the bluer the color, the richer the area. So you see that Southern Europe is struggling quite a lot, except for the Po Valley in Italy. And then we have Germany and the Nordic and Scandinavian countries that are above average in Europe when it comes to purchasing power. Sweden is a member of the EU, but we are not a member of the euro. So we have our own currency, which have saved us in the past several times, considering the shaky nature of the euro. We have a very small population. The population is about the size of New York's. When you talk to Americans, they will often say that, okay, Sweden is the size of California state and has the population of New York City. And if you look at countries in Southern Europe and Mid-Europe, also Germany, for example, they don't have a population growth. They are suffering from a shrinking population. And Sweden has, for many years, had a rising population. So we're very different from the other European countries in that sense. And even though we say that Sweden is very similar to California, the population concentration is also similar to that in California, because most of the population lives in the southern parts of Sweden. Further north, there are mostly just forests and mountains. We actually had a prime minister who said in one of his speeches, I flew over Sweden in an airplane and I looked down and there was only forests, so we should accept immigrants here. So it shows that it's a country that can accept a lot more people if they want to get there. I mean, it's very cold and dark during the winter, so it's not a very attractive place to live in that sense. And if you look at the national debt, Sweden has a debt of roughly 42% of GDP, which is much, much lower than the average debt in the EU. So even though we went through a very tough recession, the financial situation for the Swedish government is pretty good. Sweden has a rumor of being a nation of engineers and inventors, and if you want to become a CEO in a company in Sweden, it's almost mandatory that you have an engineering background. There are very few business people that become CEOs in Sweden. And Sweden is famous for their inventors. This is Alfred Nobel. And I think 2 weeks ago they announced the Nobel Prizes, and there were 7 Americans that received the prize. 6 of them were the actual real prizes, and then there was this prize in the memory of Alfred Nobel, which is a prize in economics. And here's another famous Swedish inventor that is important to American history. This is Jon Williamsson. He created the monitor, which was used in the battle in the Civil War, one of the most important naval battles. So if you go to New York, to the Battery, I think it's called, then you can see a statue of him. Well, enough with anecdotes. Sweden has had a long history of working with innovation and actively interacting with companies, owning companies, and trying to force innovation forward. We have, despite the view that Sweden is a socialist country that many people share, we have highly deregulated markets. For example, the energy markets were completely deregulated in 1995. However, there are still remnants of these state-owned companies, utilities and so on, but they are forced by law to compete completely with private businesses. And many of the state-owned companies, they actually have gone on a let's say, they have gone on a purchasing spree in Europe during the last 15 years. So many of the Swedish state-owned companies own utilities, etc., in other European countries. Early on, we saw that sustainability is a big challenge for the Scandinavian countries. So we adopted them as a key goals in the policies. So, for example, there's something called Agenda 21 that was developed within the framework of UN's climate projects in '92. And this was adopted by all the municipalities in Sweden during the 90s. So I grew up with this process of sorting your trash, etc., in order to reach the Agenda 21 goals. And we introduced a tax on carbon emissions really early, 91, which today amounts to $110 per ton CO2 emitted. And we are subject to two market-based environmental policy systems. First one is the EU emission trading scheme, which doesn't affect, for example, transport that much, but it does it indirectly. And then we have something called the electricity certificate system, which is a system that we share with our neighbor Norway. So it's a system similar to the EU ETS system. However, this system has price mechanism that's completely different, that guarantees the price of the producers of green electricity. So it's a little bit similar to the German system with green feed-in tariffs in that sense. And I've done work on both these systems. They are very good as wealth transferring mechanisms. However, they are not as good as innovation support mechanisms. And that's also one of the main critiques of them. When they were developed, they were not considered as being innovation supportive policy tools. However, politicians and people in the public administration tended to fuse in these kinds of additional functions into the systems. So the expectations on these systems were quite high. However, they didn't deliver all the things that they were supposed to. So why are we so concerned with sustainability in freight in Sweden? Well, if you look at this graph, this is a graph of the fossil fuel intensity when you look at the amount of energy being used in different sectors. And the first sector, here you can understand, this is the transport sector, the black line up here. And you can see that the progress has been very slow, and it's starting to sag a little bit here during the last couple of years. But compare that with the other industries. Like this green line is the production of electricity, and it's almost 0%, and that's due to nuclear power and hydropower. And the other line here, the orange one, is district heating. Since Sweden is a very cold country, we need a lot of heating. And this is the industry that I've been working mostly with. And as you can see, they managed to lower their share from 70% down to basically 8–9% in 2014. And this is the effect of different policy initiatives that have been taken both at the national and regional scale. So we see that there's a big challenge when we look at the disparity between these different sectors.
Can I ask a question? What fuel were they using in 1983, and what are they using now for heating?
They were using a lot of coal and a lot of oil. But they shifted over to bio fuels like forestry products. And also, this is a dirty secret of this sector. In Sweden, you can burn trash, and you're actually mandated to burn trash. So we don't use any landfills. Landfills are forbidden by law. So we even dig up the landfills and burn the stuff that's in there. But with the technology that's available, we can capture the particles. So it's hotly debated topic, should we burn trash? But it's a big part of the fuel that's being used here. So we can have a discussion about that later. But it's a very interesting aspect. So sustainability, innovation and transport in Sweden, as you saw, transport sector is facing a lot of challenges. And one of the reasons why they're facing the challenge is this political goal that our government and all the political parties in the parliament agreed on in 2009. And no one has even mentioned touching this goal. So we don't have a situation like in the US with bipartisan allegiance to sustainability goals. And that goal is to have a fossil fuel independent vehicle fleet by 2030. And that's only 12 years away, 12, 13 years away. So you can see the urgency with which our government needs to move in order to get this goal fulfilled. And then we're supposed to produce zero net emissions by 2050, the entire society. So these are very ambitious goals, and the government is spending a lot of money on research in this sector. Yeah.
To clarify, are you referring to no new vehicles produced by 2030 or no vehicles on the road that are fossil fuel?
No vehicles on the road.
Okay, so you have to eliminate any vehicle.
Exactly. So as you, considering the time span that is necessary to replace the vehicles, I would say this goal is impossible to meet unless we have some very strong like cash for clunkers scheme and so on. They have been applied in different settings, but that's the likely future scenario. And in Sweden, we have the situation is kind of similar like in the US. We have 3 different levels where the policy is created. However, the municipalities are very strong actors. And we have I think it's 290 different municipalities, which means that it can be very difficult to unite them and get them to support one particular vehicle solution or one particular planning solution. And in order to support this move, the government has also forced all the research basically to be conducted in cooperation. So we have this triple helix collaboration as a standard approach when we do research. And now we come to the business model part. As the government has seen that the changes in the transport sector are going so slowly, there's demand for business model development by researchers in order to show businesses how they could implement technology, for example, how they could change behavior. So I'm in big demand in Sweden at the moment. So moving on to the paper. This paper was co-written with Olof Moen, which is a colorful character at Gothenburg University. He has a long, both academic and professional career with good knowledge and insights into business sector. And we met at the conference, started discussing different experiences from the introduction of technology or technological innovations in the Swedish freight sector. And we soon realized that there were some commonalities in our experiences. So we said, okay, let's write a paper. So the main background for the paper is, I think the concern about sustainability, of course, and the conviction that sustainability can only be achieved if we replace current technology with something more sustainable. However, unless you're living in this socialist or communist utopia where the government decides everything, you need to have a commercially viable product. And in order to do that, you need to have a business model. And so you need to find a suitable business model. A business model is basically just a description of how the business makes money. And this is also one of the reasons why it has been a bit, the research interest in business models has been not that great historically, because, for example, from the finance or economic side, the business is often considered as a black box. You're not concerned about how it arranges itself internally. And from the policy side, they're also not really interested. They can see that they get the effect they want by raising taxes, for example, and so on. They don't really concern themselves how the business arranges itself. However, there's been a lot of research on business model and technology innovation here in California, for example, with very famous researchers that point to the role of the business models. And lately, the development of, for example, Uber and so on shows that you can produce services in radically different ways than what has been done historically. So the role of the business model has been portrayed and in academia, and it's getting more and more attention. So basically the business model and business model innovation plays a key role in the development of sustainability in urban freight. That's our conviction, and it might not be the most important part, but it's an important part when you talk to companies. Business model innovation, of course, businesses don't exist in a vacuum. They get influenced by a lot of different factors, such as the business environment, the competitors, the regulatory climate, and also expectations on regulation and business competition. So the impacts that are felt are also very difficult to what you call it? It's very difficult to say what the effects will be if you just say that regulations will be this and that, because the regulators and the economists or researchers might not know how the policy that they implement will influence how the company works internally. So there's basically a lack of understanding how business model innovation is influenced, and especially in the freight sector. So the aim of this paper was to mostly look at what kind of barriers do exist in this sector and how do they influence the adoption of technology. So if we look at the previous research on barriers, it's actually pretty thin. There is one key paper which I will present the results from here. And first of all, when you talk about barriers, you talk about two different types of barriers. The first barrier is obstruction. And this type of barriers or category of barriers assumes that the CEO or the manager that makes decisions about how the company works, it assumes that the CEO can rationally identify the correct business model for a specific setting. So you infuse the manager with a kind of processing power that's really high. And in this perspective, you say that the only thing that keeps the manager from reaching the desired business model is the lack of specific resources or the path dependence in the company. And are you familiar with the term path dependence? It basically means that the the company has been doing one thing for a very long time, so everyone in the company gets accustomed to doing things in that way. And when you start to try to change things, it's very difficult to even be aware how to change things because you have been doing it that way for such a long time. So this is the first type of barriers. And then the second kind of perspective on barriers is that there's a lot of confusion instead of obstruction. First of all, the manager or the CEO might not even know what kind of business model is correct in a certain setting. And even if he or she knew, it might be very, very difficult to know how to get there, because developing a business model or the manner in which a business is run requires trial and error. You don't really know what kind of resources you are in possession of when you're in a business. When we talk, of course you know that you have the trucks, etc., and so on. However, you might not really know what kind of talents you have and what kind of talents you require in order to do the tasks that you might think you need to do in order to fulfill a specific business model. For example, when I talk to transport operators in Sweden, one of the biggest problems they have is that their drivers are not up to the standard that they want when they want their drivers to interact with the customers. It's really difficult to find good quality drivers that can have a customer interaction that's beneficial for the company. So there was this, I talked to one CEO and he said that he had been to a conference talking to one of his clients that had been his clients for many, many years. And the CEO walked up to this client and said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, I've been delivering to you for 6 years now. How do you like the service?" And the client was completely flabbergasted and said, "No, I don't get any deliveries from you. I get deliveries from Roger." So the CEO knew, of course, that Roger was his driver, so he explained it. But this driver was so good that he had built a good personal relationship with the customer, made everything work, but he hadn't conveyed the brand of the company properly, for example. So that story shows you both plus and minuses of having a good driver that maybe not pays attention to all the things that you want from him as a CEO. So, if we want to look at business model innovation, what should we choose? What kind of cases should we choose then? So we thought a lot about that, and because we've been active in different sectors, and since the big challenge is reducing fossil fuels, and there are basically 3 different ways to reduce fossil fuels, we found that these 2 are the ones that are most interesting and most relevant to our professional background. So we looked at the replacement of fossil fuels with electricity, the introduction of heavy electric trucks, and improved logistical planning through digitization of goods. And the cases we used were previous research that we had done, about 5 different studies that have been taking place over a period of 15 years. Let's see, yeah. So when you talk about those 2 cases that we had, the electrification of heavy vehicles and the introduction of like digital technology and so on, they influence the transport supply chain in 2 different ways. First of all, if you introduce electric vehicles, you will have an influence on the transport operator in its financial conditions. And this will be a very local effect. So they are forced to buy new vehicles, basically. And if you introduce digitization, or you transfer data from paper to electronical devices, then you will, if you want to get an optimal effect, you will want to get this done in all the steps. Because if you're transferring your data into, let's say, Excel or an electronic system, if you are the only one that use that specific system, you will not gain many benefits except for the benefits that you will gain internally in your company. So you want all the other actors to use the same kind of software, same kind of hardware, in order to gain the benefits that you could with digitization. And you might look at me with question marks in your eyes, but the thing is that in Sweden, actually, the freight sector didn't digitize or digitalize until fairly recently. In one of the companies that I talked to in another project, they didn't introduce electronic waybills until 2013 or 2014. So even though Sweden is a high-tech society in many aspects, the freight sector has been very slow at adopting these things. And I will come to one of the reasons why they were slow later on. So the characteristics of these two cases. First of all, if you look at the electric vehicles, the vehicle adopter has to pay a considerable price. The vehicles that we were looking at cost between 2 to 3 times more than a normal truck. And the stakeholders that were involved, they said, no, we can't pull this off unless we get some kind of support. We want governmental subsidies, etc. Even though if we know that these trucks works, we know that they will work with our electric infrastructure, and etc. Because in Sweden we have a very good infrastructure when it comes to electricity. Since it's very cold, the trucks and cars are commonly already plugged into the electrical grid during the winter in order to heat up the engine. You might have seen, like in Russia, they put a fire under the car engine in order to heat it up sometimes. It happens in Sweden too also. It gets very cold in the northern parts. It's also very difficult to identify the value that's created through this kind of innovation, because how do you value and how do you identify cleaner air? How can you say that, oh, this was just this vehicle here that created this beautiful gap of fresh air in Gothenburg? And it's also almost impossible to transfer the costs to other stakeholders, because the customers, first of all, they don't know about the value, and they have a hard time identify where the value of the clean air comes from. And if the transport operator comes to them and say, okay, we want you to pay a little bit more, $1 more for this delivery with the electric vehicle, in most cases, they will just say no. There's a very small customer segment that is willing to pay the premium. In many cases, this segment is just about 5 to 15% in Sweden. So if you compare that with the digitization case, when we look at the digitization, there's a fear of increased transparency. What happens if we have transparency along the supply chain? Well, we end up in a situation where the transport operators will get squeezed from different actors, or vice versa. The ones that sit on the information can decide, have a much better negotiation role in the future. And it's required that the adoption is dispersed, otherwise the value creation will not be as good as it could. And in order to do that, you need to coordinate the stakeholders. And coordination is really difficult, even in a socialist society like Sweden. So, one of the main results from our study when we looked at the research that we had done was that it had always been a collective endeavor, and that this was one of the key issues that was making it very difficult to progress, to find progress. When you talk about the adoption of technology, there's always a person within the company that you can go to and say, we need you to adopt this new thing, like an IT manager or a fleet manager, etc. That is a key person that you can say, oh, this is a new innovation that you can make use of in your business. However, when you're talking about the business model innovation, it's much more dispersed. There are many more different actors, both within the company and around the company, that needs to be involved in order to make this work. There was also an interdependency between the incumbent actors in the transport supply chain. One, if you wanted to introduce a new actor, it was very difficult to get acceptance for that actor, for example. And these factors slowed down the adoption rates significantly. So when we looked at the results, the business model innovation and the technological innovation was continuous, it was ongoing, and it also happened in parallel, which meant that when you were talking about changes in the business model, the person that you were talking with could say that, okay, we know that this change would simplify the introduction of this technology. However, we also know that the technology is developing. So we might need to make changes to those changes that we already agreed on, or we might need to find another type of innovation, etc. So there is continuous and parallel progress that makes the negotiation between the actors very complex. However, in this process, the incumbent actors, the transport operators that are in place, the policymakers, etc., they use the business models of the businesses that are already active as a way of thinking of how things are and should be. So this is a kind of path dependence, a collective path dependence, as we mentioned before. This is the way we did it, and this is the way we are going to do it. It's very difficult to think outside the box. So you have businesses like Uber, for example, that is now also moving into freight, that come from the side as a completely new innovation and are just brushed off as something that won't work because it's not the way we do it. That's an example of how you can think of it. So we have a situation where the technological innovations are expected to conform with the business models that are already in place. So you don't use the business models as a tool to facilitate the new technology, because that would be too much of a hassle to change your business model. So based on these results we identified three main barriers. First of all is increased complexity, then difficulty of selecting or excluding partners, and then unclear responsibilities. And I will go into them in detail now. The situation was a little bit like this. You had a specified business model. This is the target. And then you can choose the technology that fits best with the target that you have. So the people that were involved could say that the truck doesn't really work, or the new technology that you showed us, the new software, it doesn't really fit with the way we do things here. So they could choose, basically. However, and that's a much more simpler situation than the second situation, where when you start to change the business model also, the managers and the people, the stakeholders, get this situation where they have no fixed point of reference beyond their own existing business model. So it gets very complex, and it gets very confusing for the actors that are involved. If everything is up in the air, it's very difficult to say, oh, we should make those changes or those changes. You need someone that's very strong and catalytic in the organizations in order to make this work. If we look at the transport supply chain, what do you do when you're in a complex situation? You start to reduce complexity, right? So you have a situation with all these stakeholders. You don't really know who is a key important partner when it comes to improving your business model or changing it. So you start to remove actors. However, as soon as you start to remove actors in order to reduce complexity, you also eliminate paths forward. Because let's say that the employees could have had a great impact on how to make your business model in a different way. But if you don't listen to them, it's difficult to even realize the alternative that they could have presented for you. And the final difficulty is that when you're talking about these things, it's very different from the introduction of a technological innovation. In many cases, if you want to introduce a technological innovation, you have clear and standardized routines with lawyers and policymakers that know what they're talking about. There are forms and so on. There are responsibilities. However, when you start to innovate your business model, there are no ways that you can do, there are no established ways that you can do this. So you're basically doing the work based on handshakes. And what happens then if, let's say, you're doing this business model development with different actors and one of them just says that, this isn't worth it. I'm not going to spend more money on this process. They walk away. What kind of responsibilities do they have? Then the managers in the company feel that we have no one we can put the blame on. We will stand completely alone in this situation if the business model innovation process fails. So it's better for us to sit safe in the boat and don't do anything. That's a Swedish saying. I don't know if you have the same saying in English. So, concluding this study, we found that there's beyond the 3 points, we found that there's an interconnectedness between the adoption of technology and business model innovation that's very strong and that you have to be aware of when you talk about business model innovation. And if you're in a business, you should be careful with being complacent with the business model that you have. Because as we've seen with the cases of Uber, etc., it can be dangerous to be complacent. You can be facing competitors that come in from the side and might cause much greater disruption than what you would have faced if you had been involved in the innovation process earlier. And we also saw that if the policy makers that are involved, as I showed you in the pre-presentation, policymakers are involved in all of these steps. If they are able to communicate a little bit better, they might make the innovation process easier on these people, the businesses. And finally, if the actors that are involved dedicate themselves to long-term goals instead of short project goals, common long-term goals, it can ease the process of innovation. Because many of these stakeholders that we interact with and studied, they often engaged with business model innovation as a project-based process. And when you talk about projects are often separated from the line organization, and it's very difficult to get the information that is developed in projects into the actual businesses. So that was my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
So you said there's no cash for clunkers program for the
Not now.
old trucks, and now that you're trying to get off the road for the
Yes.
cleaner technologies. And so without that and without landfills, what happens to the old trucks?
Oh, I'm not really sure, but I think that there's very high. There's a high requirement on them being recycled, the material entirely, and that's the same for personal cars. Like, so we have in Sweden we have a requirement for most producers to take care of the not only the packaging but also the product afterwards. So it has to be recyclable. But I'm not 100% sure. This is just me guessing. And of course they can sell them abroad, but that's a way to escaping your responsibilities as a producer.
Could you talk about more the difference between, since the conclusion said there is a difference between the policy-making bodies, could you talk about more the difference between local level and national level to impact the innovation?
The national level in Sweden is mostly concerned with highways and environmental standards. So it sets the standards. However, the local municipalities, they have a lot of influence on what you can do with the local built environment. So they can exclude certain kinds of vehicles from areas. So for example, in Gothenburg, there are areas where trucks longer than 10 meters are not able to drive in. And there are also areas where they set time limits. So trucks, that smaller trucks even, are not able to drive into those areas beyond a small time window of from maybe 7 in the morning to 10 in the morning. So beyond that, the drivers have to use other vehicles or wait until the next day. So the local government has a lot of power when it comes to regulating the built environment in the city. And the government doesn't concern itself with that.
So how's the current communication status between the local and national government? Are they like have a good communication right now? Or?
I would say it's very strained, but not because of any traffic-related issues. Something I left out of the presentation is that Sweden has, during the last 2 years, gone through been a major actor in something called the Migrant Crisis in Europe. And this has put a lot of strain on the relationship between the national government and the municipalities, because when the migrants came to Sweden, the national government paid for all the expenses that are associated with the migrants. However, they were only going to pay those expenses for 2 years. And we're closing in on or already stepped over the threshold where the municipalities are starting to pay for these expenses. And the refugees are still in school. It's very difficult to get an employment in Sweden because we have the amount of human capital that you need in order to get just a basic job as a cleaner, for example. A cleaner in Sweden is actually expected to have a quite serious education because you're handling chemicals and machinery and so on. So the situation is kind of tough for the municipalities. And this means that these kinds of more long-term issues has ended up in the background. And the debate has instead been on these more urgent issues. So right now I would just say that the communication between the national and the local is kind of strained.
I would like to clarify kind of the 2 dimensions that you've been talking about. One, you gave us kind of 2 different sustainability options. One, the clean truck, which is a single firm's kind of responsibility, and 2, the ICT connections that actually have to involve partners in cooperation. from starting with the clean truck, presumably, if Swedish government were willing to subsidize the truck so that it didn't cost the firm any more than its current truck did, that would be the end of discussion.
Yes.
And it really wouldn't matter because there are no other partners that have to be part of the change in behavior.
Yes.
So as long as the firm's willing to change its business model, everything is fine. But anything that has to do with collaboration across the supply chain, whether it's a sustainability strategy or not, always, right, ends up being a different problem because of the requirements for cooperation. So it seems like it would be interesting to think about if you're going to talk about sustainability, sort of similar things that would generate barriers of one way or another. Because I think it's kind of hard to separate what's happening because of the cooperation problem versus the strategy itself.
Yeah, that's a good comment. You might separate the paper into two instead, or change the research question a little bit in order to accommodate that perspective.
I think I would, because the equivalent might be, you know, and this is happening here, right? We're on this mission for cleaning up trucks, just as in Sweden. And it really, aside, it really does not affect either the receiver or the freight forwarder or anybody else, actually. But there are other sustainability strategies that would. And
Absolutely.
so I think it might be interesting to think about a categorization of strategies that are, sort of in order of the number of parties that they
get involved. Yeah.
And it might be clearer. Your barriers may become a whole lot clearer because it may be that, for example, a bilateral agreement wouldn't be so hard. But when you get 4 parties in there, and there are a dozen freight forwarders and all that stuff, right? Then it becomes really complicated.
I agree fully. It's still a tentative paper, so that's why it was presented on the conference. So, and it's when you look at the work you've done here, for example, and together with RPI, you see this very impressive categorizations and working through the relationships, etc. And that would be ideal to achieve that. Unfortunately, this has been like a retrospective meta-analysis of our previous research, so it's a bit difficult to add it on to that, but it's a good way forward, maybe.
And you may have companies that, for example, not all trucking firms would accept, even if you give me all the subsidies in the world, I don't want to do this.
Yes.
Because I'm going to have to change my business model. And you might be interested to see what kind of companies those are versus the ones that say, sure, give me the money and I'll play around with it.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a very interesting future project, if nothing else. Any other questions?
I was going to ask this question actually, but it's kind of related to that. So you've talked about how there are different stakeholders and there are challenges in selecting which stakeholder you want to include and exclude. And then we have challenges once you're trying to basically overhaul the entire system, the body. What's the process when you're actually selecting them? How do you, when there's a period when you think, okay, these are the right stakeholders, versus when they are on board, like when you're supposed to convince them, which is going to be difficult, where, like you said, there'll be stakeholders which is like, yeah, there'll be firm which says, I don't want to do it, right? So that's one kind of challenge that I think is present. So what are the other kind of challenges?
Yeah, that would be a paper in itself, I would say. Because in my experience, when I look back at the projects I was involved in, the stakeholders were chosen basically because they were interested. So the companies, these were major companies in Sweden, they went out and talked to people they knew and said, we need those and those people. And then they came to the university, for example, and talked to me and said, oh, we have this group, we want to do this study, can you help us? And then I would say, okay, but what about this perspective and this perspective? And that, oh, maybe we don't really need that group because we already know what the end customer is going to say. They don't want to pay anything extra, and so on. So it's unfortunately in reality they tend to approach the people that they already have contact with, and they tend to choose to ignore the ones that they consider difficult. And this is one of the reasons why we found the results like this. So it's not something that I should discuss further maybe in detail, but as you see.
What you're bringing to mind is something, I'm going to put Lee on the spot, who's done all this work on electric vehicle adoption. And, you know, there's such a thing as the early innovator, right? Who, at least in the EV world, there's a lot of understanding or knowledge that the early adopter is a very different person than the later adopter, right?
In the cases I've been looking into, there have been this kind of characteristic of an early adopter. They have been very enthusiastic about looking at new technology. And they've been working with different types of new trucks for 30 years. So you have a kind of self-selecting bias, or what you call it?
I think one thing that just strikes me is the two different worlds that you're talking about in some regard. When you talked about the trucking companies that didn't have representatives that could talk, or the delivery guys could really talk with the customers in a way that made sense or was good for the company. So that was one world, and now I'm trying to remember what my other world was. I just lost it. The other world was very different than that. Oh, because of all of the technology, as in a Silicon Valley kind of thing, so that there's really two totally different perspectives when you get into the innovation and what that means to them as individuals and companies, I would think.
Yeah, and when you look at innovation research, in many cases, the reason why these companies like Uber, etc., are backed by venture capital instead of maybe a traditional bank active in the sector is because when these kinds of new innovators approach the industry, they get met with this traditional view that, that's not the way we do it here. And the thing that you're suggesting is just hilarious. It will never work. So even it goes back even to the financiers. Because if you're going to lend money, borrow money in order to set up a trucking company, you will end up with a banking person that's fairly knowledgeable about how trucking works, etc. And that person will dismiss your new ideas about a new business model straight up. So you see this in many different industries, that the venture capital acts as a catalyst for these new kinds of innovations, just because they don't belong to this world of the trucking world, for example. I don't know if I interpreted your question correctly, but that's what I see.
Any other questions?
I guess it's more of a technical one. How is range procured for the large trucks? Are they not traveling very long distances? Do they often stop for long periods to refuel? Because that seems like if you're trying to get trucks that are That's something that's still not completely resolved in what we've been looking at. It's these larger ones being able to go the same distance that the diesel ones can at the moment of refueling time.
Yes, when it comes to the electric vehicles, these were demonstration projects and what you call it, simulations. And they used real, we had gathered all the data from a transport company about all the deliveries, and then we analyzed it and saw how much was the average truck traveling, which distances could we use the battery electric trucks to cover, and then we kind of did different changes to these routes in order to accommodate the electrical vehicles better and so on. And when you look at the ranges, we had 80 kilometers, 100 and 120 as the ranges that we worked with in the initial project. And then later on we decided that we could cover basically all the deliveries with these ranges. So, but we're talking about Gothenburg, which is much smaller than Los Angeles. But in Sweden, that setting would work for urban deliveries. So a range of 120 kilometers would cover almost all deliveries in Sweden. But these are, the system is a hubs and spokes system. So you're delivering from one hub to another, and in the hub you have the local electric vehicle that takes care of the transport.
So I'm just wondering, like, you gave us a very nice and detailed introduction of Sweden and its policy. So do you think the three barriers you mentioned also apply to other countries or specifically to Sweden?
We try to make them as general as possible. That's why they are so fluffy. And so we try to make them so that you could probably apply them somewhere else.
I heard a lot of similarities with experiences that we've had here, actually. Okay, well, we should thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you very much.